Welcome to Perimenopause Hell. This presentation is on the topic of ablation. We don't actually recommend ablation in our group, and we're going to discuss why. Ablation is a treatment that is offered for heavy periods and abnormal bleeding. 25% of women who have an ablation will go on to have a hysterectomy within 5 years anyway. The cauterized uterine lining is not supposed to bleed after ablation. There's not supposed to be any periods at all after an ablation. However, sometimes ablation does not work and women continue to have periods, and most ablations fail within 5 years anyway. So that means that within the 5 years, the periods will start again anyway, and it may fail sooner than 5 years. So it may be that you only have some relief for 18 months or less than that, and you may have bleeding, but it's lighter. So it works in a small way. Whatever, we do not think that it's worth taking the risk, and we'll go on to discuss why we think there is too much of a risk. So let's look at what ablation actually is. An ablation cauterizes the lining of the uterus or womb. The name for this lining is the endometrium. And by cauterize, we mean burn. So cauterizing is the medical word for burning. And there are all sorts of different ways that this burning can be done. What you're looking at is a balloon ablation, where the burning device is actually inflated into the womb. And this probably offers a reasonably good coverage of the endometrium. So there's lots of different ways that you can see. This shows 3 different ones. The first one on the left is the Novashore bipolar radio frequency. So it uses like a microwave radio frequency technology to ablate the endometrium. The middle one shows another balloon style. And option C shows cryoablation, where it uses like cold to cauterize it instead. So it's a cryogenic, it's frozen essentially. So there's lots and lots of different types. This only looks at 3 different ones. There are many, many more than that. But essentially, what you are looking at is burning the inside of your womb. There are lots and lots of contraindications for ablations, and what we find, unfortunately, is that lots of surgeons and gynecologists are ignoring these contraindications and doing the ablation anyway. You should not have an ablation if you have fibroids. If we look at the diagram on the right, you can see that where fibroids are growing in the lining of the womb and the endometrium, that they make the shape of the uterus different, and they distort the shape of the uterus, so the wand that's used to do the ablation can't work as well as it should. And also, the fibroids themselves are made up of different types of cells than the endometrium, and they don't cauterize very well. Now, some doctors will say that if your fibroids aren't very big, then it's okay to have the ablation, but some don't seem concerned at all about fibroids, which is completely wrong. Another contraindication of ablation is if you have any unusual shape to your uterus. The picture shows some genetic abnormalities or birth defects in the shape of the uterus, so bicornuate or any unusual shaped uterus, heart-shaped uteruses. Also, if your uterus is larger than the actual instrument being used to do the ablation, then it won't work correctly. And if your uterus is tilted in any way other than the standard usual shape of a uterus. Since we're all different, I do wonder how reliable these devices can be. Other contraindications are endometrial hyperplasia, and since so many women with heavy bleeding have endometrial hyperplasia, that probably excludes a vast majority of perimenopausal women anyway who have heavy bleeding. Any suspicion of cancer, which includes endometrial hyperplasia, means that you should not have an ablation done. And the reason for this is once your womb lining, once the endometrium is ablated, it cannot then be biopsied properly. So in that situation, there must be a biopsy taken before any ablation is done. Of course, if you have a desire for more children, you mustn't have an ablation either, because the fetus cannot grow properly and implant properly into a uterus that has been ablated. Tubal ligation is also contraindicated for the reason I have read that it can cause problems with the blood supply to the ovaries and make post-tubal ligation syndrome more likely. Also, if you have any suspected or diagnosed pelvic inflammatory disease, and if you have any scarring or adhesions of the uterine lining. So if you had a cesarean section, then that might cause scarring or adhesion of the endometrium, and that means that the ablation of those areas will not work correctly. And in fact, if you already have adhesions, which are basically scarring gone mad inside of your uterus, where you've had some sort of surgery or they're just naturally occurring, then where the wand actually cauterizes you, your own body might start adding more scars to that rather than it healing in a nice clean way. This is not even an exhaustive list of contraindications to ablation, and the fact that doctors are ignoring these and going ahead with them anyway just shows how cavalier some of these people can be. So the problems with ablation, apart from the failure of the procedure, which means that women still have their heavy periods, there is a problem among some women where they have pockets of trapped endometrium, i.e. the lining of the uterus, and those trapped pockets still bleed every month, but the blood can't escape. That's very painful. And there have also been cases where the cauterization of the endometrium, they have burned through the endometrium, causing it to attach to the bladder or bowel. And if you have a hysterectomy afterwards, as so many women go on to, this doesn't always rectify this situation, and you can actually require reconstructive surgery. Of course, the other problem amongst all this is the unwillingness of surgeons to admit there are problems with this procedure, especially if they are legally liable. This has led to some women having to go into different counties so that they speak to surgeons that have no professional association with each other, so they can actually get help rather than surgeons covering up for each other. Of course, if a surgeon thinks he's going to be sued, then he's not going to admit that he made a mistake. So what I'd like to look at now is some quotes from women who've had ablations that have really gone badly wrong. These are real life quotes. Do not take the doctor's word for granted. Research, research, research. Find the cause of your bleeding and pain first. Chances are your condition is contraindicated for ablation anyway. At best, it is just a temporary quick fix. At worst, it turns your life into a living hell and causes so many more problems than it ever solves. I thought it would solve my problems, and for a few months it did. Now I have worse pain, and not only around the time of my period. Repairing damage from a botched ablation can be difficult, as in this case. I had nothing but trouble. Partial hysterectomy in September, was feeling good until April. Now I have another surgery scheduled, excruciating pain, adhesions, etc. It's a living nightmare. There is no other procedure in the medical field that essentially kills your organ and then leaves it in you, serving no purpose other than potential complications, or to make an easy dollar. Would never go through with it if I knew the truth about side effects and that you're more or less going to need a hysterectomy afterwards to fix or correct after effects from ablation. Endometrial ablation should be banned. Think about the fact that you could lose your uterus in only a couple of years just because of scar tissue and the pain. For me, it just put a band-aid on the issues. Now they are back in full force with some new ones added. Worst medical mistake I've ever made. The other thing that we have to acknowledge is that some women have been given this procedure without any anaesthesia. Definitely do not trust any doctor who wants to perform one without anaesthesia. It's extremely painful and you need a general anaesthetic. I would say my personal experience is I was burned alive for 8 minutes straight, screaming, crying and begging the doctor to stop. Health went downhill from there. Lost jobs, lost the ability to function, gained weight and an autoimmune disease, plus lots of pain and sleepless nights. I would also say, don't listen to women online who say it's the best thing I've ever done. You don't know them from beans. And you don't know who they work for. If you have a friend that says it worked for them, remember that a lot of people can't admit when they are wrong and like to pretend everything is great, even a bad decision they've made. That's the end of this presentation. So you couldn't pay me to have an ablation. I think they are far too dangerous. Anyone that's had something like that happen to them, it's not worth the risk, in my opinion. If you found this video interesting, then please like and subscribe and all that YouTube jazz. The link to the group is in the description box below. We have Facebook, MeWe and Twitter now. Thank you very much for watching and cheerio.